Okay, chapter 191, Cranky Jem's History. My father's name was Robert Cuffin. At the death of his father, he succeeded to a good business as grocer and tea dealer. But he was very extravagant and soon became bankrupt. He obtained his certificate and then embarked as a wine merchant. At the expiration of 3 years, he failed again and once more appeared in the Gazette. This time he was refused his certificate. He, however, set up in business a third time and became a coal merchant. His extravagances continued, and so did his misfortunes. He failed, was thrown into prison, and took the benefit of the Insolvents Act, but not without a long remand. On his release from jail, he turned dry salter. This new trade lasted a short time and ended as all the others had done. Another residence in prison, another application to the Insolvents Court, and another remand ensued. My father was now 40 years of age and completely ruined. He had no credit, no resources, no means of commencing business again. He was, however, provided with a wife and 7 children, all requiring maintenance, and he having nothing to maintain them on. I was not as yet born. It appears that my father sat down one evening in a very doleful humor and in a very miserable garret to meditate upon his circumstances. He revolved 1,000 schemes in his head, but all required some little credit or capital wherewith to make a commencement, and he had neither. At length he started up, slapped his hand briskly upon the table, and exclaimed, "By heavens, I've got it!" "Got what?" demanded his wife. "A call," replied his father. "My father." "A call," said his better half in astonishment. "Yes, a call," repeated my father, "a call from above to preach the blessed gospel and cleanse the unsavory vessels of earth from their sinfulness." His wife began to cry, for she thought that distress had turned his brain, but he soon convinced her that he was never more in earnest in his life. He desired her to make the room look as neat as possible and get a neighbor to take care of the children for an hour or two in the evening when he should return with a few friends. He then went out, and his wife obeyed his instructions. Sure enough, in the evening, back came my father with a huge Bible under one arm and a prayer book under the other, and followed by 6 demure-looking ladies and gentlemen who had a curious knack of keeping their eyes incessantly fixed upward or heavenward, as my father used to express it. While the visitors sat down, and my father, whose countenance had assumed a most wonderful gravity of expression since the morning, opened the prayer meeting with a psalm. He then read passages from the 2 sacred books he had brought with him. He wound up the service by an extemporaneous discourse which drew tears from the eyes of his audience. The prayer meeting being over, an elderly lady felt herself so overcome with my father's convincing eloquence that a considerate old gentleman sent for a bottle of gin, and thus my father's call was duly celebrated. To be brief, so well did my father play his cards that he soon gathered about him a numerous congregation. A chapel was hired somewhere in Goodman's Fields, and he was now a popular minister. His flock placed unbounded confidence in him, nay, almost worshipped him, so that, thanks to their liberality, he was soon provided with a nicely furnished house in the immediate vicinity of the chapel. Next door to him there dwelt a poor widow named Ashford, who had a very pretty daughter called Ruth. These females were amongst the most devoted of my father's flock, and in their eyes the reverend preacher was the pattern of virtue and holiness. The widow was compelled to take a little gin at times for the stomach's sake, but one day she imbibed too much, fell down in a fit, and died. My father prepared a funeral sermon in which he eulogized her as a saint, and he afforded an asylum to the orphan girl. Ruth accordingly became an inmate of my father's house. And now commences the most extraordinary portion of the history of my father's life. You will admit that the suddenness of his call was remarkable enough, but this was nothing to the marvelous nature of a vision which one night appeared to him. Its import was duly communicated to Miss Ashford the next day, and the young lady piously resigned herself to that fate which my father assured her was the will of heaven. In a few months the consequences of the vision developed themselves, for Miss Ashford was discovered to be in the family way. My father's lawful wife raised a storm which for some time seemed beyond the possibility of mitigation. The deacons of the chapel called, and the elders of the congregation came to investigate the matter. My father received them with a countenance expressive of more than ordinary demureness and solemnity. A conclave was held. Explanations were demanded of by my father. Then was it that the author of my being rose, and in a most impressive manner acquainted the assembly with the nature of his vision. "The angel of the Lord," he said, "appeared to me one night and ordered me to raise up seed of righteousness, so that when the Lord calls me unto himself, fitting heirs to carry on the good work which I have commenced may not fail. I appealed to the angel in behalf of my own lawfully begotten offspring, but the angel's command brooked no remonstrances, and willed that I should raise up seed with Ruth Ashford, for she is blessed in that her name is Ruth. This explanation was deemed perfectly satisfactory, and when the deacons and elders had departed, my father succeeded somehow or another not only in pacifying his wife, but also in reconciling her to the amour which he still carried on with Miss Ashford. In other words, his father was a piece of work. Thus my father preserved both his mistress and his sanctity, at least for some considerable time longer. The fruit of that amour was myself, and my name is consequently Ashford, James Ashford, although my father insisted on calling me Cuffin. Time wore on, but by degrees the jealousies which my father had at first succeeded in appeasing developed themselves in an alarming manner between the wife and the mistress. Scenes of violence occurred at the house of his reverence, and the neighbors began to think that their minister's amour was not quite so holy in its nature as he had represented it. The congregation fell off, and my father's reputation for sanctity was rapidly wearing out. Still, he would not part with my mother and me, and the result was that his lawful wife left the house with all her own children. My father refused to support them. The parish officers interfered, and the scandal was grievously aggravated. Death arrived at this juncture to carry away the principal bone of contention. My mother became dangerously ill, and after languishing in a hopeless condition for a few weeks, breathed her last. Having thus stated the particulars of my birth, it will not be necessary to dwell on this portion of my narrative. I will only just observe that, at the death of Miss Ashford, a reconciliation was effected between my father and his wife, and the former contrived to maintain his post as minister of the chapel, though with a diminished flock and consequently with a decreased revenue. Nevertheless, I obtained a smattering of education at the school belonging to the chapel, and was treated with kindness by my father, although with great harshness by his wife. Thus continued matters until I was 15, when my father died, and I was immediately thrust out of doors to shift for myself. I was totally friendless. Vainly did I call upon the deacons and elders of the congregation. Even those who had adhered to my father to the very last had their eyes opened now that he was no longer present to reason with them. They spurned me from their doors, and I was left to beg or steal. I chose the former, but one night I was taken up by a watchman. There were no police in those times, because I was found wandering about without being able to give a satisfactory account of myself. You may look astonished, but I can assure you that when a poor devil says, "I'm starving, houseless, friendless, penniless," it is supposed to mean that he can't give a satisfactory account of himself. In the morning I was taken before the magistrate and committed to the house of correction as a rogue and a vagabond. In prison I became acquainted with a number of young thieves and pickpockets, and so desperate was my condition that when the day of emancipation arrived I was easily persuaded to join them. Then commenced a career which I would gladly recall, but cannot. Among my new companions I obtained the name of Cranky, because I was subject to fits of deep despondency and remorse, so that they fancied I was not right in my head. In time I became the most expert housebreaker in London, Tom the Cracksman alone excepted. My exploits grew more and more daring, and on 3 occasions I got into trouble. The first and second times I was sent to the hulks. I remember that on my second trial, a pal of mine was acquitted through a flaw in the indictment. He was charged with having broken into and burglariously entered a jeweler's shop. It was, however, proved by one of the prosecutor's own witnesses that the shop door had been accidentally left unlocked and unbolted, and that consequently he had entered without any violence at all. Thanks to the laws, he escaped on that ground, although the judge and jury were both convinced of his guilt. Time wore on, and I formed new acquaintances in the line to which I was devoted. These were Tom the Cracksman, Bill Bolter, Dick Flarer, the Buffer, and the Resurrection Man. With them I accomplished many successful burglaries, but at length I got into trouble a third time, and a stop was put to my career in London. It was in the year 1835 that the Resurrection Man and I broke into a jeweler's shop on Prince's Street, Soho. We got off with a good booty. The Resurrection Man went over to the Mint. I left Dick Flarer into the secret, gave him a part of my share in the plunder, and then took to a hiding place, which there is in Chick Lane, Smithfield. Now I knew that Dick was stanch to the backbone, and so he proved himself, for he brought me my food as regularly as possible at the end of a week. And at the end of a week, the storm had blown over enough to enable me to leave my hiding place. I hastened to join the Resurrection Man in the Mint, where I stayed 2 or 3 days. Then the miscreant sold me in order to save himself, and we were both committed to Newgate. Tidkins turned king's evidence, and I was sentenced to transportation for life. The Resurrection Man was discharged at the termination of the business of the sessions. Myself and several other convicts who were sentenced at the same session were removed from Newgate to the penitentiary at Millbank. Amongst the number were 2 persons whose names you may have heard before, because their case made a great noise at the time. These were Robert Stevens and Hugh McChisel. who were the principal parties concerned in a conspiracy to pass a certain Eliza Sidney off as a young man. And we remember them, right? And defraud the Earl of Warrington out of a considerable property. We remained about a fortnight in the penitentiary and were then transferred to the convict ship at Woolwich. But before we left Millbank, we were clothed in new suits of grey and pepper and salt, as we called the color. And we were also ironed. The convict ship was well arranged for its miserable purpose. On each side of the between decks were 2 rows of sleeping berths, one above the other. Each berth was about 6 feet square and was calculated to hold 4 convicts, 18 inches space to sleep in being considered ample room enough for each individual. The hospital was in the forepart of the vessel and was separated from the prison by means of a bulkhead, in which partition there were 2 strong doors forming a means of communication between the 2 compartments. The fore and main hatchways between decks were fitted up with strong wooden stanchions round them, and in each of those stanchions there was a door with 3 padlocks to let the convicts in and out and secure them effectually at night. In each hatchway a ladder was placed for us to go up and down by, and these ladders were always pulled on deck after dusk. Scuttle holes, or small ports to open and shut for the admission of air, were cut along the vessel's sides, and in the partition between the prison and the hospital was fixed a large stove with a funnel, which warmed and ventilated both compartments at the same time. When we were placed on board the convict ship, we each had a pair of shoes, 2 pair of trousers, 4 shirts, and other warm clothing, besides a bed, bolster, and blanket. Of Bibles, Testaments, and prayer books there was also plenty. The moment the surgeon came on board, he arranged the mess berths and mess tables. All the clothing, linen, bedding, and other articles were marked with consecutive numerals in black paint, from number 1 up to the highest number of convicts embarked. Thus we messed and slept along the prison deck in regular numerical progression. In food we were not stinted. Each man had 3/4 of a pound of biscuit daily, and every day, too, we sat down to beef, pork, or pea soup. Gruel and cocoa were served out for breakfast and supper. Every week we received a certain quantity of vinegar, lime juice, and sugar, which were taken as preventives for scurvy. Each mess selected a head or chairman who saw the provisions weighed out and that justice was done in this particular to each individual at his table. The surgeon selected 6 of the most fitting amongst the convicts to act the part of petty officers, whose duty it was to see his orders punctually executed and to report instances of misconduct. 4 of these remained in the prison, and the other 2 were stationed on deck to watch those convicts who came up in their turns for airing. The captains of the deck, as the officers were called, had some little extra allowance for their trouble, and were moreover allowed a certain quantity of tobacco. It was in January 1836 that we sailed for Sydney. Although I had no wife, no children, and I may almost say no friend that I cared about, still my heart sank within me when, from the deck of the convict ship, I caught a last glimpse of the white cliffs of old England. Tears came into my eyes, and I, who had not wept since childhood, wept then. But there were several of my companions who had left wives and children or parents behind them, and I could read on their countenances the anguish which filled their inmost souls. The surgeon was a kind and humane man. The moment we were out of sight of land, he ordered our chains to be taken off, and he allowed us to enjoy as much air upon deck as we could possibly require. The guard, under the command of a commissioned officer, consisted of 31 men and did duty on the quarter-deck in 3 alternate watches. A sentry with a drawn cutlass stood at each hatchway, and the soldiers on the hatch always had their firearms loaded. When we had been to sea a little time, most of the convicts relapsed into their old habits of swearing, lying, and obscene conversation. They also gambled at pitch and toss, the stakes being their rations. Thieving prevailed to a very great extent, for the convict who lost his dinner by gambling was sure to get one by stealing. They would often make wagers amongst themselves as to who was the most expert thief, and when the point was put to a practical test, dreadful quarrels would arise. The loser of the wager, perhaps, discovering that he himself was the victim of the trial of skill, and that his hoard of lime juice, sugar, tobacco, and biscuit had disappeared. Stevens, who was at the same mess with myself, did all he could to discourage these practices, but the others pronounced him a false magician, and even his friend McChisel turned against him. So at last he gave up the idea of introducing a reformation amongst his brethren in bondage. The fact is that any convict who attempts to humbug the others by pretensions to honesty, or who expresses some superior delicacy of sentiment, which, of course, in many instances is actually experienced, had better hang himself at once. The equality of the convict ship is a frightful equality, the equality of crime, the leveling influence of villainy. the abolition of all social distinctions by the hideous Freemasonry of turpitude, and its consequent penalties. And yet there is an aristocracy even in the prison of the convict ship, an aristocracy consisting of the oldest thieves, in contradistinction to the youngest, and of townies, in opposite to yokels. The deference paid by the younger thieves to the elder ones is astonishing. And that man who, in relating his own history, can enumerate the greatest number of atrocities is a king amongst convicts. Some of the best informed of the convicts wrote slang journals during the passage and read them once a week to the rest. They generally referred to the sprees of the night and contained entertaining entries. I must observe that while the ship was still in the Thames, none of the convicts would admit that they deserved their fate. They all proclaimed themselves much injured individuals and declared that the Home Secretary was certain to order a commutation of their sentence. The usual declarations were these: I am sure never to see New South Wales. The prejudice of the judge against me at the trial were evident to all present in the court. The jury were totally misled by his summing up. My friends are doing everything they can for me, and I'm sure to get off. Out of 110 convicts, at least 100 spoke in this manner. But the ship sailed. England was far behind, and not one single convict had his hopes of a commuted sentence gratified. Then, when those hopes had disappeared, they all opened their budget of gossip most freely and related their exploits in so frank a manner that it was very easy to perceive the justice of the verdicts which had condemned them. The voyage out was, on the whole, a tolerably fine one. It lasted 4 months and a half, and it was consequently in the middle of May that we arrived in sight of Sydney. But when thus at the point of destination, the sea became so rough and the wind blew such great guns that the captain declared there was mischief at hand. The convicts were all ordered into the prison, the ports of which were closed, and the heat was stifling. The tempest came with appalling violence. Crash went every loose thing on board. The timbers creaked as if they would start from their settings. The ropes rattled, and the wind whistled horribly through the rigging. The ship was lifted to an immense height, and then by the fall of the mountain wave was plunged into the depths of the trough of the sea, at one moment dipping the studding sail boom into the water, and the next lying near on its beam ends on the opposite side. I afterwards learnt from a sailor that the waves were 40 feet high, 20 below the ordinary level of sea and 20 above it. Thus, when we were in the rough, they were 40 feet above our heads. When we were in the trough, they were 40 feet above our heads. Towards evening, the storm subsided, and early next morning, Sydney broke more clearly upon our view. Sydney is beautifully situated. It possesses a fine ascent from a noble harbor, and its bays, its coves, its gardens, its gentlemen's seats form a pleasing spectacle. Then its forests of masts, the government house with its beautiful domain, the numerous wharfs, the thousands of boats upon the glassy water, and Woolloomooloo with its charming villas and its windmills. All these combine to enhance the interest of the scene. The town itself is far more handsome than I had expected to find. The shops were very fine, particularly the silversmiths, the haberdashers and confectioners, which would not disgrace the West End of London. They are most lighted with gas, and in the evening have a brilliant appearance. There is an astonishing number of grog shops, nearly 250 for a population of 30,000 souls. George Street and Pitt Street are the principal thoroughfares, and the rents are so high that they average from £300 to £500 a year. The ship entered the harbor. Our irons had already been put on again some days previously, and we were all landed under the care of the guard. We were marched to the jail yard, and there our clothes were all daubed over with broad arrows and the initials P.S., meaning prisoners' barracks, to which establishment we were conducted as soon as the ceremony of painting our garments was complete. This barrack had several large day rooms and numerous sleeping wards, the bedsteads being arranged in 2 tiers or large platforms, but without separation. In every room there was a man in charge who was answerable for the conduct of the rest, but no one ever thought of complaining of the misbehavior of his companions. A treadmill was attached to the building. There were moreover several solitary cells, a species of punishment, the horrors of which no tongue can describe. In the course of a few days, we were all divided into sections according to the degrees of punishment which we were to undergo. Stevens and McChisel were kept at Sydney. I was sent with some 30 others to Port Macquarie, a place about 260 miles as the crow flies to the north of Sydney. The scene is magnificent in the neighborhood of Macquarie Harbor, but the life of the convict, oh, that is fearful in the extreme. I know that I was a great criminal. I know that my deeds demanded a severe punishment, but death had been preferable to a doom like that. Compelled to endure every kind of privation, shut out from the rest of the world, restricted to a very limited quantity of food which never included fresh meat, kept in chains and under a military guard with fixed bayonets and loaded firearms, with no indulgence for good conduct, but severe penalties, even flogging or solitary confinement for the smallest offenses, constantly toiling in the wet, at felling timber and rolling it to the water, forced to support without murmuring the most terrible hardships. How did I curse the day when I rendered myself liable to the discipline of this hell upon earth? I will give you an idea of the horrors of that place. During the 6 months that I remained there, 19 deaths occurred amongst 220 convicts, and of those 19, only 5 were from natural causes. 2 were drowned, 4 were killed by the falling of trees, 3 were shot by the military, and 5 were murdered by their comrades. And why were those murders perpetrated? Because the assassins were tired of life but had not the courage to commit suicide, and therefore they accomplished crimes which were sure to be visited by death upon the scaffold. The chain gang to which I belonged was stationed at Phillips Creek, and our business was to supply timber for the shipbuilders on Sarah's Island. We were lodged in huts of the most miserable description, and though our toils were so long and arduous, our rations were scarcely sufficient to keep body and soul together. The timber we cut was principally pine. No beasts of burden were allowed, and we had to roll the trunks of trees to an immense distance. What with the humid climate, the want of fresh meat, and the severity of the labor, no man who fell ill ever entertained a hope of recovery. Talk of England, talk of the humane principles of her penal laws, why the Inquisition itself could not have been more horrible than the doom of the convict at Macquarie Harbor. Again, I say it was true that we were great criminals, but surely some adequate mode of punishment, some mode involving the means of reformation, might have been devised, without the application of so much real physical torture. I have heard or read that when the Inquisition put its victims to the rack, it afterwards remanded them to their dungeons and allowed them leisure to recover and be cured. But in the penal settlement of Port Macquarie, those tortures were renewed daily, and they killed the miserable sufferers by inches. I had not been at Macquarie Harbor more than 5 months when Stevens and McChisel arrived and were added to our chain gang. This punishment they had incurred for having endeavored to escape from Sydney, where they had been treated with some indulgence in consequence of their station in life, previous to their sentence in England. So miserable was I with hard work and scanty food that I resolved to leave the place or perish in the attempt. I communicated my design to Stevens and McChisel, and they agreed to accompany me. Escape from Macquarie was known to be a most difficult undertaking, and few convicts who essayed it were ever able to reach the settlements in other parts of the colony. They were either murdered by their comrades for a supply of food or perished in the bush. Formidable forests had to be traversed, and the chance of catching kangaroos was the only prospect of obtaining the means of existence. Nevertheless, I resolved to dare all those horrors and fearful risks rather than remain at Phillips Creek. 5 or 6 others, in addition to Stevens and McChisel, agreed to adopt this desperate venture with me, and one night we stole away to the number of 10 from the huts. Yes, we thus set out on this tremendous undertaking, each individual possessing no more food than was sufficient for a single meal, and ere the sun rose, all our store was consumed, and we found ourselves in the middle of a vast forest, without a guide, without victuals, almost without hope. Convicts are not the men to cheer each other. Misfortunes have made them selfish, brutal, and sulky. We toiled on in comparative silence. One of my companions, who had been 10 years at Macquarie Harbor, was well acquainted with the mode in which the locals search for traces of opossum, and when hunger began to press upon us, he examined every tree with a hollow limb, and also the adjacent tree for marks of the opossum's claws. For I must tell you that this animal is so sagacious, and it usually runs up a neighboring tree, and thence jumps to the one wherein its retreat is, in order to avoid being traced. The convict whom I have alluded, and whose name was Blackley, had at length discovered the trail of an opossum, and clambered up the tree in which its hole was found by means of successive notches in the bark to place the great toe in. Having reached the hole, he probed it with a long stick and found that there actually was an opossum within. Thrusting in his hand, he seized the animal by the tail and pulled it out. We made a fire and cooked it, and thus contrived just to mitigate the terrible cravings of hunger. The flesh of the opossum is like that of a rabbit, and is therefore too delicate to enable a hearty appetite to make a good meal on a 10th portion of so small an animal. On the following day, Blackley managed to kill a kangaroo weighing about 60 pounds, and thus we were supplied with food for 3 or 4 days, acting economically. We continued our way amidst the forest, which appeared endless, and in due time the kangaroo's flesh was consumed. Blackley was unwearied in his exertions to provide food, and so much time was wasted in these endeavors that we made but little progress in our journey. And now, to our terror, he could find no more opossums, could kill no more kangaroos. We grew desperate. Starvation was before us. Moody, sulky, glaring on each other with horribly significant ferocity, we dragged ourselves along. 4 days elapsed, and not a mouthful of food had we touched. On the 5th night we made a fire, and sat round it at considerable distances from each other. We all endeavored to remain awake. We trembled at the approach of drowsiness, for we knew the consequences of sleep in our desperate condition. There we sat, none uttering a word, with cracked and bloody lips, parched throats, eyes glowing with cannibal fires, our minds a prey to the most appalling thoughts. At length McChisel, the lawyer, fell back in a sound slumber, having no doubt found it impossible to bear up against the weariness which was creeping over him. Then Blackley rose and went farther into the wood. It requires no ghost to tell us that he had gone to cut a club for a horrible purpose. Okay, I'm actually going to read ahead, because if they do actually eat McChisel, I don't want to read it out loud. So I'll be back. Okay, so I'm going to give you a summary. So Blackley headed off into the forest. They figured to find something to use as a club. And then they hear him screaming. So something's gone on out there, but they don't want to wander out into the dark forest because they figure it's not safe. So another dude amongst the convicts just grabs a knife and kills McChisel. So Cranky Jem and Stevens are like, we want nothing to do with this. So they wandered off and let the criminals do what they were going to do. And then the next morning, they find Blackley out in the forest, wrapped in the coils of a giant snake who has killed him and is clearly going to eat him. So they keep going on their way, and the group separates and goes in different directions. Cranky Jem gets caught by prison guards from a different prison who recognize that he's wearing prison clothes. He gets taken up again, held in another location, manages another escape from there. In that escape, is able to get on board a merchant vessel, which he sails around with a whole bunch until he ends up back in England, which is when he met up with the Zingarees, which we knew that he had, wandered around with them a whole bunch, and then he ends it by explaining his sudden meeting with and attack upon the Resurrection Man at a certain house in St. Giles's. So that's his history. He was a convict in Australia, escaped several times. The story talks a lot about the horrible conditions of prisoners, but didn't particularly want to have to read out loud about cannibalism. So that takes us up to the present. All right, we'll see you in the next chapter.